I started sharing stories through music and poetry when I was 13. And I want to share one of those stories with you today. The story that I'm about to share also happened when I was 13. It's the first time that I ever had a gun pulled out on me. My cousin Corey and I had made a bet on who can get back to the house the fastest from a convenience store. As we were running, an officer saw us, swerved his car in front of us, pulled out his gun, and shouted to hold up your hands. It felt like a movie. Everything was surreal. My heart was beating 1,000 times a minute. My body froze up. I was shocked. At that age, the only engagement that I had with an officer was with my school resource officer and my Uncle Daryl. I immediately did what he asked as my cousin continually ran like an Olympic track athlete back to the house to let our moms know that an officer had stopped us at gunpoint and was accusing us of robbing a convenience store. As Corey and my mom rushed back to the scene, they saw red and blue flashing lights, me standing against the car with my hand behind my back as the officer frisked me. I had a wild imagination, so I started having flashbacks of scared straight episodes that I had seen on daytime television. I started getting mentally prepared to go to prison. The officer ran my name through the computer and found it, sort of. Michael Trimble, age 23, came up as a previous felon that had robbed several convenience stores in Aurora, Colorado. The officer had told my mom that there had been several robberies in the area, so when he saw us running, he automatically thought that we had been up to something. The narrative that ran through the officer's mind is that he saw two black youth running. They must have committed a crime. But he's not alone. Being young and black is a dangerous narrative in the minds of a lot of people. But that's not the only time that I had a gun pulled out on me. 5 years later, I was invited to a house party. I had went to go pick up my friend JoJo before heading out. I was at his house for 20 minutes when I heard his front door kick in. Officers rushed in with bulletproof vests and guns. Confused and scared, I automatically thought they must have had the wrong house. Because of my previous situation, I thought this was a mistake, just like when I was 13. Then one of the officers reached into my friend's front pocket and pulled out some ecstasy. Now, I had never been arrested, had no drugs on me, and had no idea that my friend was under investigation. But that didn't stop the officer from throwing me to the ground, putting my hands behind my back, and searching my pockets. And even though he didn't find anything, he handcuffed both of us and took us in for interrogation and holding. Now, because I'd never been arrested before, I didn't realize the first thing that I should have done was contact an attorney. JoJo bailed out that night, and because I couldn't get in contact with anyone, I was forced into general population. Now, I had heard horror stories about jail and prison, so as they were taking me into the cell, I was a bit terrified. But after being in there for days, weeks, months, jail became less of an idea to me. I started developing relationships with some of the inmates. It's amazing how when you hear somebody's story, they become less of an idea and more of a reflection of yourself. And the more that I listened to their stories, the more that I realized that their story sounded just like my story. I was just another story, another person caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time. How many stories like mine get swept up under the rug every day? I met an inmate named Charles who ran Bible study, and he asked about my case. And after giving him the details, he gave me a number to his attorney. Within 48 hours of that conversation, I was released. Had been in jail for 3 months. My car had been impounded and sold within a police auction. Had lost my job, lost my place to stay. In a moment, my life was put on pause while the rest of the world continued. Racial profiling has always been a part of my reality as a young black man growing up. I started creating beats and rhymes as a way to take back my narrative and redirect the ideas and stereotypes they had up over me. Hip-hop artist and educator KRS-One says, "I'm a manifestation of study, not a manifestation of money. Therefore, I advance through thought, not what's manufactured or bought." Within that narrative, KRS-One is taking back his narrative and telling the world who he is. The root culture of hip-hop teaches us to push against societal norms, take back our narrative, and let the world know who we are. In Denver, Colorado, African-American youth make up 13% of the population, but they're 32% of the juvenile correctional facilities, jails, and prisons. In comparison to their white peers, who make up 25% of the city population and only 17% of the juvenile correctional facilities, jails, and prisons. We're all ideas to one another until we've had challenging, progressive conversations that make us look outside of ourselves. Every person in this room has bias. There's not a person in this room that doesn't have some style of stigma, stereotype, or overgeneralization of themselves. We're all trapped in these echo chambers of one another. Until we challenge the narrative and the ways that we see one another, we're all victims of this unconscious idea that sits inside of us. In 2014, after the death of Mike Brown in Ferguson and Jesse Hernandez in Denver, Colorado, community members like myself wanted to see sustainable change and accountability happening. And then Nina Horton and Gia Orlando invited me to be a part of a conversation between two very unlikely groups, officers and young people. They wanted to bring together conversations that broke down the ideas and bridged the gap between kids and cops. Because of my previous situations and things that I'd seen on social media, I was very skeptical of this working. In fact, at one point, I didn't even know if I wanted to talk to an officer myself yet. But after facilitating my first workshop, I heard young people vocalize their pains, their hurts, their angers, their angst. I heard officers do the same thing. Within facilitating my first implicit bias workshop, I started to realize how emotionally attached to these ideas I was myself. I heard groups of kids describe black and brown people as thugs, as drug dealers, criminals. At one of the first forums that I facilitated, I heard one of the officers vocalize how he was angry about the ways that officers were being portrayed in the news and social media. He said, "We're being portrayed as the bad guys." And then one of the young men got up, grabbed a newspaper, and pointed out all the times that black and brown people were depicted as the criminals. He said, "This is what we feel like every day too." The officer later said that it was an eye-opening experience that he may have never have realized until he had a conversation with that young man. It was conversations like this that made me more invested in the work that was happening on this platform. So this is how our days work and how they look for our forums. At the beginning of the day, officers usually walk into the room and they're in one corner of the room. Young people are usually in another corner of the room. There's always a bit of tension in the air. And then I set the norms for the day, let them know what the expectations are, what I expect them to be like when they communicate with one another. And then I do breathing exercises, something that I learned from Peace Warriors and Thich Nhat Hanh. Within it, we have them get up, breathe, and release and center themselves. We want to break some of that tension before we get into a heavy discussion. I share poetry, words of vulnerability, to let them know that it's okay to be vulnerable in these conversations. And in fact, if you are more vulnerable, it's probably going to be more things that come from these conversations. After that, officers go into their training where they're getting trained on adolescent development, emotional intelligence, and implicit bias. Young people are being trained in their own rooms where they're getting trained their constitutional rights, implicit bias. And they're also getting the chance to kind of unpack some of these ideas that they feel inside of themselves before they get into these conversations. They break bread and then come back together. Within it, they have conversations that are led by community facilitators, people who are from the community, who lead out these conversations, where officers are giving tips to young people to keep them safe, and youth are giving tips to officers to help them understand who they are, let them know that they're still developing, they're still in process. After that, they talk about next steps and the ways that they can continually progress these communications and conversations that they're having between one another. Now, I won't lie to you and say that officers and young people leave these conversations friends. But what I will say is that they've broken down the wall of idea and became a little bit more human to one another. In 2009, after the death of Oscar Grant, we woke up. In 2015, after the death of Mike Brown and Jesse Hernandez, community members like myself were angry. We wanted to see accountability happening. Until we can have empathy and understanding of another person's struggle, we'll continually be ideas to one another. What I challenge everybody in this room today to do is to look within yourself in the moments when you're looking at somebody as an idea and find a little bit of empathy, a little bit of understanding. Until we can have challenging, progressive conversations that make us look outside of ourselves and have a little empathy and a little bit of understanding, we'll continually be ideas to one another. I challenge you to stop being an idea and look at each other as a little bit more human. Thank you.